My name's James Gossip. I'm Senior Archaeologist at Cornwall Archaeological Unit, and I was the lead archaeologist on the King Arthur's Hall project. King Arthur's Hall sits in an area of common grazeland on Bodmin Moor, with Garrow Tor to the east and Router to the northeast, and as the LiDAR mapping shows, in a relatively empty landscape. The monument's without any known parallels and consists of a rectangular bank of earth and stone measuring 21 by 49 metres internally, with 56 orthostats, or standing stones, surviving on the inner face of the embankment, some of which measure up to 1.8 metres high and are either leaning, recumbent or partially buried. A pool of water lies in the interior, possibly fed by a spring, although this isn't verified, and it may just become seasonally wet due to the earlier excavation of the interior. The site's on the Heritage at Risk register due to scrub growth and animal damage, and before recent renewed interest had suffered from significant neglect. In the early stages of the monumental improvement project, the site was flagged up to the Historic England Heritage at Risk officer, Anne Preston Jones, by local Bodmin Moor group time seekers, who recognised the site as being in need of increased awareness, protection and understanding. The first event to be carried out was volunteer clearance, supervised by CAU, in advance of an updated and detailed topographic survey as the first step towards improving the management of the monument. Fundamental to this was developing a project to establish a chronology for the site. As a scheduled monument, this first required preparation of a project design to support scheduled monument consent, outlining a methodology for excavation, sampling and recording, most likely to achieve a successful result. The project design identified a team of specialists and resources that would see the project through its development, excavation stages, sampling, analysis, archiving, all the way through to publication. Funding was provided by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Historic England and Cornwall Heritage Trust. 3 areas were selected for excavation. Firstly, the main trench, known as Trench 1, where we selected an area of the eroded bank in the southwest corner of the monument that had the potential to pick up leats and channels identified by geophysical survey. Secondly, a test pit focused on one of the leaning orthostats as a means of understanding how this was supported and how the problem of the leaning stones might be addressed, for instance, to see if re-erection could be possible. And thirdly, a number of test pits outside the scheduled monument to the north focused on a range of geophysical survey anomalies. In the event, though, these anomalies turned out not to be archaeological, but instead represented natural geological processes, or possibly the removal of stones from the moor. Excavation finally took place in September 2022, carried out by CAU and assisted by a team of volunteers from Time Seekers and Cornwall Archaeological Society, supported by a team of experts and officers from the Monumental Improvement Project. Most of the work focused on Trench 1, the principal trench through the bank, with all stages and deposits plotted by centimetre accurate GPS and all layers excavated stratigraphically by hand. This revealed the stone and earth core of the bank, probably heaped from excavation of the interior of the site, and crucially it identified peaty soils representing old land surfaces buried under the bank, with a written description made of each layer, a detailed drawing of the cross-section and a 3D photogrammetry record of the entire trench. The cross-section through the bank was used to identify locations for sampling that had the most potential for providing a successful date, using a technique known as optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL for short. OSL is a method for measuring the time since sediments were deposited. Certain minerals, including quartz and feldspars, can store energy which occurs in the environment as a result of natural radiation. If exposed to sunlight, for example when the monument was being created, this stored energy is released and the OSL signal is reset to 0. When buried again, the OSL signal starts to accumulate once more. By measuring the buildup of energy and the natural radiation dose, we can calculate how long it's been since the sediments were last buried. Tim Kinnaird from St Andrews University and Sam Turner from the University of Newcastle took horizontal core samples from the bank and underlying buried soils, carrying out initial testing in the field to establish background control readings. In addition, environmental coring of peat deposits in the interior was carried out by Rob Batchelor of Reading University, taking 49 samples in total. And alongside this, geological analysis of the orthostats was carried out by Callum Beeson of Camborne School of Mines, confirming that the stones were most likely to have come from a source local to the site, perhaps more stones surrounding King Arthur's Hall. The OSL dating was successful in establishing the first ever chronology for the site, showing that King Arthur's Hall was constructed in the Middle Neolithic period around 3000 BC. Radiocarbon dating of peat deposits shows further use of the site in the late Iron Age around 360 to 100 BC, and again at the end of the early medieval period around 1030 to 1210 AD. The King Arthur's Hall project has been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity using scientific dating to understand more about this unique and enigmatic monument, fundamentally answering the question, when was King Arthur's Hall built?
I'm Pete Herring. I'm the president of the Cornwall Archaeological Society, and the Society is one of the partners of the Monumental Improvement Project. We're talking about one of the 40 sites in the Monumental Improvement Project, King Arthur's Hall, or Arthur's Hall. It's orientated north-south. It has substantial banks up to 10 metres wide and 2 metres high, but there are no ditches. The bank material seems to have been dug from the interior of the enclosure, and it was cut down to the bedrock, it seems, or possibly paved. The effect of that is that there is a marshy pool with peat now up to 2 metres deep in places in the centre of the enclosure, and the enclosure is lined by 56 standing stones, possibly 140 originally. Many of them appear to have been lost. There's no obvious entrance, although there is a breach in the southwest corner. It's in Bodmin Moor with great views, especially to Routor, and in an area of rough grazing on the border between the two great manors of Blisland and Hamatethy. There's archaeological remains of banks and leats to the west and to the south of the hall. Nearby also is Arthur's Hall, and whatever is great and the use and author unknown is attributed to Arthur, the great archaeologist William Borlase in 1754. Over 25 people have studied King Arthur's Hall, suggesting 22 distinct interpretations which can be grouped into 9 general functions: ritual, dealing with the dead, gathering the community, observing the cosmos, settlement, defence, securing animals, storing fuel, storing water. Dates that have been suggested range from early Neolithic to Bronze Age to Roman to early medieval and to later medieval. And there may be many other thoughts that people have not put down on paper. It is a mysterious monument, hence the ascription to Arthur or King Arthur. OSL dating by Tim Kinnaird and Sam Turner showed that the bank was constructed in the late 4th millennium BC, in the Neolithic period. What was the contemporary moorland like at that time? There would have been variable vegetation cover. The gradual removal of woodlands had already begun and was nearly 1,000 years on from the earlier Neolithic period. There was an increase in rough grassland with mixed scrub and herbs. Pastoral farming using domesticated animals, cattle, sheep and goats, was probably seasonal, exploiting the long summer of Bodmin Moor from May to October, when the grasses there are the most palatable. People would have developed a close knowledge of their environment, the resources, the opportunities and the risks. It'd be very helpful if the long history of the vegetation change on Bodmin Moor could be elaborated on by analysis of a peat core taken by Rob Batchelor of Reading University from a bog nearby. We can see that substantial effort was needed to create the hall, an area excavated by stone and organic tools, antlers and such like. 49 by 21 metres equals 1,029 square metres, a mix of rab and slabby stones, some removed from the bedrock. An enormous effort, but in a millennium of enormous change and effort, some that we hardly perceive. The removal of those wood pastures, if not forests, using simple hand tools. What else might have been preoccupying people of the moor? People were still probably mobile, and monuments may have been their fixed points in their world, and the gatherings were presumably at fixed times in their year. This was a period too of people developing attachments to places, developing territories, whilst still sharing extensive resources like the moor's grassland pastures, creating early forms of commons. The sustainable management of commons has long been the basis of rural administration and might extend back into the Neolithic. The rights and responsibilities and possible limitations on levels of use may create a context for a pound. Ritual, ceremony and ideology are also important. It is difficult now for us to establish the concerns and ideas that may have underpinned the design of ritual and ceremonial monuments. An interpretation is made harder at King Arthur's Hall because there are no directly comparable sites. Other different types of sites on the moor indicate interest in cosmic events. The north-south long axis of the hall might be to allow observation of the equinoxes or the pole star, then the fairly faint Thuban. Other monuments suggest that tours were at least as significant as cosmic features and events like the solstices and equinoxes. Their tours may have been regarded as structures inherited from powerful predecessors or ancestors. And perhaps King Arthur's Hall tells us that we may have underestimated the importance of water in monuments. There are other monument types in the 4th millennium on Bodmin Moor that we can place King Arthur's Hall alongside. The tor enclosures were still in use. Routor and Delank were within 2 kilometres of the hall. These are distinctive, incorporating natural tors and probably held multi-purpose gatherings like fairs, where there was exchange of goods, ceremony involving ritual, administration, probably including considering those commons, as well as socialising. There were also cromlechs or portal dolmens, possibly still in use around the moor at places like Liscite and Tretheavy. These were also probably gathering places for ceremonies and rituals, referring to ancestors or predecessors, for people to consider their place in the natural world and the cosmos, as well as, of course, for funerary use, possibly including excarnation. The prop stones are maybe the moorland equivalents of those missing chambered tombs. Possible example nearby at Garrow Tor. They could be as early as the hall. The one at Liskernick seems to have a midsummer alignment that can be dated to around 3700 BC. And there are also long cairns, probably from the 4th millennium. Loudon Hill and Cat's Hole are 2.5 kilometres away. Again, gathering places with funerary functions. And one of the more peculiar types of monument on the moor, the bank cairns, equivalent of bank barrows, 300 or 400 metres long, probably of the same period as the hall, involving substantial effort, as indeed we see was the case at the hall. Archaeologists, when they've been considering King Arthur's Hall, have been struck by the lack of obvious parallels to it. A couple of sites are quite often referred to, although when you see them, the differences are greater than the similarities to King Arthur's Hall. Grange Circle at Loch Gur in County Limerick in Ireland has slabs against a thick bank, a bit like at King Arthur's Hall, but that is circular. Crocuno in Morbihan in Brittany is a rectangle. It has upright stones, but there's no bank at all. Both of these sites, Loch Gur and Crocuno, are of interest. They emphasize the importance of people studying and considering the cosmos, alignments with sunsets and sunrises at key moments in the year. Another kind of site that is similar in some ways to King Arthur's Hall, found mainly in Britain, is the mortuary enclosure. Again, quite mysterious sites, mainly rectangular, some squarish, same sort of date, late 4th millennium, early 3rd millennium BC. These are places where people think that bodies were brought for excarnation or display before they were put into more permanent burials. But all of the mortuary enclosures that we know of are different in significant ways in their structures from King Arthur's Hall. Much slighter banks, ditches as much as banks, and no pools or sunken areas within them. The second date that we've got from King Arthur's Hall is much later Iron Age, about 2,500 years ago, and this is derived from a radiocarbon date from the interior, from the peat that's developed. The contemporary moorland then was a very different one. Now, acid grasslands were extensive. There was probably seasonal grazing via transhumance, that is, grazing livestock being accompanied by people to milk them and make cheese and butter. Professor Charles Thomas and others have suggested that the Cornish administrative areas called hundreds had their origins in later prehistory. If so, the four that divide the moor would have existed by this time, and King Arthur's Hall may have been used, as it was in the early medieval period perhaps, as a pound for securing livestock caught trespassing on Trig hundreds pastures without permission. And such a use may have commenced in later prehistory, adapting a Neolithic structure by clearing out its interior. Was King Arthur's form also a model for other pounds? If we look at the three other hundreds, King Arthur's Hall is there on the left in this slide, and the other three are shown at the same scale. Higher Town or Drift Pound in Lisnooth Hundred is similar in scale and shape to the hall, as is Crow Pound in West Wiltshire. In fact, Crow Pound is slightly larger than King Arthur's Hall, and much larger is Stowe's Pound, reusing the tor enclosure that we've heard about before, for a pound for East Wiltshire Hundred. The third date that was obtained from King Arthur's Hall by the scientific dating methods was again from the interior, from the peat that had accumulated because of the waterlogging. This came out as medieval, early 2nd millennium AD, and it was from a radiocarbon date. We can look again at the context of the hall at that time and notice that there was a leat, that is a watercourse, that ran right beside the southwestern entrance or breach of the hall. The most likely explanation of that date is that we are actually dating this tapping of the reservoir that the hall had become by tin stream workers for water that they required to operate their streamworks at Lees, about a kilometre to the southeast of the hall. As hoped, we have improved our understanding of one aspect of King Arthur's Hall, and that is its date, or rather its dates. We now have three very interesting and early dates. They've solved some of the issues. Many of those possible interpretations that had been proposed can be eliminated, but it also leaves us with the King Arthur's Hall as a place of mystery. It hasn't parallels. We still have to think hard about what it was and what its meaning was to the people who created it and used it at each of those three dates. And it does remind us of the reason for the name of the hall. This is, after all, Arthur's Hall, and whatever is great and the use and author unknown is attributed to Arthur. At least we now know its dates, but we still, I'm afraid, do not know its use.